Jane Mansfield, one of the most explosive bombshells ever dropped on Hollywood. The buxom blonde from Texas, believe it or not, claimed to have an IQ of 163, genius level. But Jane wasn't exactly known around town for being the girl with the big brains.
I'm Rockwell Hunter, Miss Barlow.
Rockwell Hunter? His name sounds influential. His name only so happens to be Rockwell Hunter. What do you do?
I work for LaSalle Jr., Raskin, Pooley, and Crockett. The advertising agency?
Oh, those names, how crazy influential.
By the time Jane Mansfield died in a harrowing car crash on June 29, 1967, she was hounded by rumors of devil worship, drinking, and debauchery. Her career had been relegated to grocery store openings and small-time dinner theater. In fact, it was after an appearance at a Biloxi, Mississippi supper club that her tragic fate was sealed. How did one of Hollywood's most notorious glamour girls meet such a gruesome end? On this episode of Mysteries and Scandals, we'll expose the truth behind the myth. We'll have an exclusive interview with Jane's son, Zoltan Hargitay, who was asleep in the car on the night of the fatal accident.
If she wanted to pull me out of the front seat, and she stayed in the back, then I would have been history.
Noted film historian Charles Champlin will give us an inside look at Jane's troubled career and her untimely death.
And I just felt a sadness. I mean, I shocked because it was just a ghastly way to die.
And Hugh Hefner will remember one of his favorite centerfolds.
You know, she died tragically, and in an ironic way, that also keeps the mystique alive.
Jane Mansfield's story will also be told through archival footage, classic film clips,
Leave and walk out on all this publicity?
as well as rare photographs and dramatic reenactments. I'm A.J. Benza. Join us as we take a look back at one of Hollywood's favorite sex sirens and explore the unhappy ending to the fast and furious life of Jane Mansfield. Jane Mansfield is memorialized here in this Hollywood cemetery, but she was born Vera Jane Palmer in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania on April 19, 1933. Jane's early childhood was marked by tragedy, an eerie foreshadowing of her own fate. Jane's press agent, Ray Strait, explains.
When Jane was 3 years old, her father had a heart attack. They were driving down the hill. He died in the car, and it was just a tragic, tragic thing. And it was very fortunate that her and her mother survived the accident. The family moved to Dallas, Texas, and Jane hated the place, absolutely hated the place.
So Jane devised a plan to take her far away from Texas. The buxom teenager believed the movies just might be her ticket out of obscurity. But at age 16, Jane's plans for fame and fortune were derailed when she discovered she was pregnant.
She'd married young and dragged her husband and their baby to Hollywood, and she was still maybe just out of her teens.
Jane was determined to bust into the business, so to speak. Hollywood folklore has it that she picked up the phone and called Paramount Pictures and said, "My name's Jane Mansfield and I want to be a movie star." See, nowadays you'd get a dial tone, but back in 1954, she was invited to come down here for a screen test. They gave her a scene from, of all things, Joan of Arc. Her performance didn't exactly set the studio executives on fire. It's pretty hard to buy a saint with a 40-inch bust line, so no contract offer. On the personal front, Jane's marriage disintegrated. Her husband moved back to his native Texas while Jane and the baby stayed in Hollywood. Jane then moved into high gear when she hooked up with legendary Hollywood publicity man Jim Byron.
One day, this lady with rather mousy brown hair, as he said, came into his office and threw back her shoulders and said, "I've got the biggest ones in Hollywood and I want you to make me a star."
When we return, we'll take a look at how Jane Mansfield splashed onto the Hollywood scene and examine how a career that held such promise could unravel so quickly and end so tragically. In 1955, aspiring starlet Jane Mansfield finagled an invitation to a press junket in Florida for a picture starring another full-figured actress, Jane Russell. It was here that Mansfield made a bold move to grab attention with a publicity stunt orchestrated with her new publicist, Jim Byron.
He introduced her to some men in the press and got her a free pass on the plane to the premiere of Underwater, which was a Jane Russell picture. A bikini or a red bikini came from somewhere, but it didn't fit Jane, and she knew when she plunged into the water, when she came up, there'd be no bikini, and that was the end of Jane Russell and Underwater in Florida, and Jane Mansfield became a household name from that day forward.
So subtlety wasn't exactly a word in Jane's vocabulary, but savvy was. Jane parlayed the attention from her Florida publicity stunt into a movie contract with Warner Brothers, but the deal only resulted in a few bit parts. Sabin Gray is the president of the Jane Mansfield fan club.
They dropped her pretty quickly, and she went on to do a small independent film called The Burglar. And while she was shooting that movie, she saw in the newspaper a open call for an actress in a play. So she went to audition in New York for a play called Will Success Spoil Rock Hunter.
Of course, Jane wasn't timid about accepting the role. Audiences cheered her portrayal of a dumb, blonde movie vixen. The New York theater critics were less than complimentary, but Jane didn't care. She was on her way to stardom. High school classmate Ann Wedgeworth remembers her friend's ambitions.
She said, this is a stepping stone on my way to the top. Now, how many people do you hear her say that?
Author Jim Haspiel met Jane Mansfield in New York while she was on Broadway. He remembers the night she met her male counterpart, former Mr. Universe, Mickey Hargitay.
Mae West act included a group of bodybuilders, and Mickey Hargitay, then Mr. Universe, was in the act, and Jane, on seeing Mickey, supposedly said to the waiter, "I'll have a steak and that man on the right."
Grade A beef all around. For Jane and Mickey, it was love at first sight. Never one to waste time, Jane quickly married the media-hungry bodybuilder who seemed to enjoy the spotlight as much as she did.
They were a very physical couple. He would often pick her up and hold her above his head and twirl her around for the photographers. And they were quite a sight to see.
When it came time to make the movie version of Will Success Spoil Rock Hunter, Jane was chosen to co-star alongside Tony Randall and Groucho Marx.
Rita, I love you.
Oh, and I love you, Georgie. But why did you wait so long to tell me? You know, you never even tried to kiss me.
I never could get that close.
You got it made.
Did she ever? On the heels of her success, one of Hollywood's biggest studios decided to position Jane as the new Marilyn Monroe.
20th Century Fox had been so upset with Marilyn Monroe, who was in New York on strike, that they opted to buy Jane's contract out and to present her as Marilyn Monroe king size, is the way they put it, and put her in those roles that Marilyn didn't want to play.
Jane, on the other hand, was more than happy to take those roles. Fox tapped her for a film called The Girl Can't Help It, playing yet another dumb blind. Then studio execs decided it was time to test Jane Mansfield's range as an actress. They cast her in a dramatic role. The film was The Wayward Bus, based on a John Steinbeck novel.
Simple as ABC.
SEX, you mean? Look, you're a salesman, so am I. We both know what the score is. It's even.
But SEX was still Jane's greatest commodity. Hardly a surprise that she would catch the eye of Playboy magazine's Hugh Hefner.
Well, I think that Jane Mansfield was bigger than life. I think that to some extent, and it's a curious phenomenon, Marilyn Monroe's impact on the 50s was so dramatic that there were clones or variations on the theme. And I think that Jane Mansfield was the most successful of those. We did almost an annual pictorial on her. In the case of Jane Mansfield, the pictorials actually helped make her a star. And she knew it.
Yeah, a big star, and certainly one who could boost the morale of troops overseas. Jane joined Bob Hope for a trio of his USO tours.
Have you anything to say?
Well, I'm ready to fight.
You're ready to fight? No, honey, it's a Cold War, and I think you'll fix it.
So Jane had finally arrived, but the road ahead was about to get pretty rocky. When we come back, we'll look at the falling star and how her unquenchable thirst for fame began to destroy her life. We'll also dispel the myths surrounding that now famous car crash that took the life of one of America's favorite sex kittens, Jane Mansfield. By the end of the 1950s, Jane Mansfield had finally achieved movie star status, but it was to be short-lived. Mansfield's life was about to become a decade-long battle with disappointment, scandal, and despair. Welcome back to Mysteries and Scandals. I'm A.J. Benza. Jane and her husband, former Mr. Universe Mickey Hargitay, moved into this Beverly Hills estate back in March of 1958 with Jane's daughter from her first marriage and the couple's newborn son. And for a while there, let's just say that Jane was in the pink. Senior daily variety columnist Army Archard fondly recalls being a guest in Jane's home.
Jane and Mickey invited me over there one day when we were doing a special little segment about what the stars like to do, and she, of course, liked to exercise. And she was teaching me some of her exercises. There wasn't almost anything that she wouldn't do for publicity.
Singer Engelbert Humperdinck was a friend of Jane's. He purchased the Pink Palace in 1978 for a cool $2 million. That's a lot of Las Vegas lounge shows.
Behind this wall, there's 100 front covers of Jane Mansfield. Right behind here. 100 front covers. And I put this wall here to protect them and preserve them for posterity, you know. Her attributes were, of course, what every man or producer, director ever wanted, you know, I would say.
So it would seem. But Jane's career was not living up to the hype. Fox decided Jane was not movie star material after all. It was 1959, and the studio began to loan her out to overseas productions.
Why are you staring at me like that? Have you never seen a blonde before?
I myself enjoy filming in Hollywood. I enjoy filming in Europe. I wouldn't want to confine it to one place or the other.
In 1963, Jane jumped at the opportunity to do a film in the States called Promises, Promises. But there was a twist. Jane had to get naked. And in those days, on-screen nudity was a no-no. Playboy magazine was there to cover what Jane uncovered.
For an American actress to make a film with any nudity in it was, in the early 1960s, revolutionary. And because of the long-standing relationship between Jane Mansfield and ourselves, we elected to do a pictorial based on that film. That caused an absolute sensation, more of a sensation than we had anticipated, because in Chicago, they called it obscene, and they arrested me and held a kind of a mock trial on the basis of the pictorial.
Hefner ended up paying a $200 fine. There was a huge public outcry, and the film was actually banned in some parts of the country. Audiences, it seemed, had seen just about enough of Jane Mansfield. Jane's career was in deep trouble. And so was her marriage. The couple split. But Jane didn't waste any time finding a new man. She met and married a director named Matt Cimber. Jane hoped Cimber would be her ticket back to the top.
He was going to do for her what Arthur Miller did for Marilyn Monroe.
But in reality, Jane's new husband had less clout in the film business than she did. Mansfield eventually found her way back to the big screen, starring opposite Mamie Van Doren in the 1966 film Las Vegas Hillbillies.
Oh, hello, Boots, darling. I thought it was about time to get acquainted with Woody. We were practically relatives, you know.
You two kissing cousins, enjoy yourself. I've got work to do.
Pure camp, and still another bad choice.
I really wanted to say something to her and say, look, you know, I know why we're doing this movie, Jane. You know, where we could laugh about it.
Right. They were doing it for the bucks. After all, she had a new baby to support. That made 5 kids by 3 different husbands. And the woman was desperate to maintain her movie star lifestyle.
Gone a lot, and when she was gone, we had a couple of people taking care of us, and of course I had my father there when he wasn't working. But she had such love, she wanted to bring us along as much as she could.
I think she would like to be remembered as being a wonderful mother. And I know that she was. I mean, she loved her children so much.
So much that when her brief marriage to Matt Cimber ended, Jane went to court to fight for sole custody of their baby. Her lawyer was a shady character by the name of Sam Brody. He and Jane soon became lovers.
He had a wife who was handicapped and 2 children, and it was a huge scandal. It didn't reflect well on Jane because He left his 2 children and his wife, who was handicapped, to be with this glamorous sex symbol, and that's more bad press that Jane didn't need.
At this point, the only press Jane Mansfield was getting was bad. She struggled to maintain her glamorous image, but let's be honest, her career was history. The word is that she began to hit the bottle pretty hard, which only made things worse. Jane's life was in a downward spiral and headed toward a tragic and violent end. And just ahead, we'll look at the final chapter in Jane Mansfield's sad life, dispel some of the lingering rumors, and clear up one of the myths surrounding the crash that ended her short but sensational life. By 1967, Jane Mansfield's roller coaster life had hit bottom. The glory days of the Pink Palace were over, and to the American public, Jane Mansfield was yesterday's news. All that was left were the rumors. So as promised, let's set the record straight. First of all, what about this genius IQ of hers?
I would be deeply suspicious that it was 163, because it seems to me if you have an IQ of 163, you somehow end up in a little bit better charge of your life. Either you go completely crazy early on, or you take better control of yourself. And I think that her life spun out of control.
For my observations, and the numbers involved with Jane Mansfield did not go up to 163. I think the highest was 40, and that was her bust.
Another rumor that dogged Jane for years is that she was a devil worshiper. She was once photographed with famed 60s Satanist Anton LaVey as part of another wild publicity ploy.
Biggest backfire of a press stunt that she ever pulled. Jane thought she'd get a lot of publicity out of Anton LaVey because he was getting so much publicity as Satanism. Well, Satanism has become a joke nowadays, but to Jane it was a joke then. It meant nothing to her.
But her career meant everything, and film roles for Jane had dried up. So she was forced to make a living doing personal appearances and performing in small nightclubs, showcasing both her physical attributes and her limited musical talents.
A sable will do for the rain. I'm just plain Jane.
I think that that kind of sexual attraction, physical attraction, I think is a very perishable commodity. I mean, I think you just don't last long. I think at the end, I mean, she's sitting in men's laps at a nightclub in Mississippi someplace. I can't imagine what her future held.
And neither could Jane. By now, according to biographers, Jane's drinking was out of control. One of her ex-husbands was claiming she was an unfit mother. Her eldest daughter went to police and claimed physical abuse at the hands of Jane's lover, Sam Brody. But despite all the turmoil, Jane jumped at the opportunity to perform when her friend Mamie Van Doren asked her to fill in for her at a supper club in Mississippi.
I called her and said, would you please do this for me? And she says, she was really surprised. And she says, yeah. She says, that's good because I love to get away. The timing is perfect. I'm going to take the kids down there. We need a vacation.
It was June of 1967. Jane, 3 of her kids, and boyfriend Sam Brody headed off to Biloxi, Mississippi. Jane was scheduled to headline at Gus Stevens' Supper Club. It was to be her final curtain call. Always the publicity hound, Jane agreed to make a talk show appearance in New Orleans. Louis Evans, who worked for Gus Stevens, was supposed to drive Jane, Sam, and the kids to New Orleans.
So all I know is I was just told that we were going to take them over in Gus's car, but I asked Ronnie to go because I had a physical for the military the next morning. I didn't figure I'd be back in time.
Ronnie Harrison was a local boy who also worked at the supper club with Evans. The night of the accident, Jane's son Zoltan was just 6 years old.
And I can remember my mom going to this gas station and pulling me out of the front seat and telling me I had to go in the back seat. I remember her doing this and saying, oh, you're going to be okay. I was dead tired, man. I just wanted to go back to sleep. Okay, Mom, whatever.
In that car, sitting between Mansfield and Ronnie Harrison, was Jane's then attorney/lover, Sam Brody. In the back seat of this car, 3 of her children were lying down asleep, which literally saved their lives. They were doing something like 80 miles an hour and coming around a curve, and there was a truck that was spraying insecticide for mosquitoes that loomed ahead of them, and in the awfulness of that moment, the car went into the back of this trailer truck, and the top of the car was sheared off.
And everyone in the front seat was killed. And my brother, me, and my sister survived.
And of course, the biggest rumor of all is that Jane Mansfield was decapitated in the accident.
Jane was wearing a wig, and it flew up in the air and came down and landed on the hood of the car. This initiated the myth that she had been decapitated. She was not decapitated at all. Police photographs of her body uncovered at the scene illustrate clearly that she was not decapitated. This myth would be left for her children to live with when it didn't happen. I mean, death is final and awful enough.
But despite all the misconceptions, Jane's children carry the memory not of a glamorous movie star, but of a loving mother who was taken from them too soon.
But we definitely had guardian angels that evening. And I think one of them was my mom, for me. Because she saved my life. She did.
Jane Mansfield was only 34 years old when she died, leaving behind 5 children. A star who never achieved the level of greatness she dreamed of, but who, for one brief moment in Hollywood history, made her mark. In the end, it was Jane's horrendous death that would bring her more fame than she ever achieved in life. I'm A.J. Benza. Join me the next time our paths cross in a state of mind called Hollywood.